Box FM with fear.
Hello, welcome to Horror Box FM. I am still with you today. My name is Ethan, and for 12 years, I worked as a backcountry ranger for the National Park Service. My jurisdiction was Blackwood Ridge, a 300,000-acre expanse of dense, uncharted wilderness in northern Maine. It is a beautiful place by day, but by night, it changes. I know these woods. I know the behavioral patterns of every predator, the distinct snap of a pine branch under weight, and the exact layout of every mapped and unmapped trail. But what happened to me during the late autumn of 2024 ruined my life. It is a memory that has permanently altered my perception of reality, leaving me staring at the dark corners of my bedroom every single night, waiting for the shadows to move. It was the third week of November. The tourist season had ended a month prior, leaving the park completely deserted. A heavy, suffocating silence had settled over the forest, the kind that only comes when the ground freezes solid but the snow has yet to fall. The temperature had plummeted to 12 degrees Fahrenheit. At exactly 4:17 p.m., just as the sun was dipping below the jagged tree line, the radio in my isolated ranger station crackled to life. Sector 7 was an area we internally called the Dead Zone. It was a massive, low-lying basin choked with ancient black spruce and dense thickets of briar. It was a dead zone in every sense of the word. GPS signals failed there, compass needles spun erratically due to localized iron deposits, and even the local wildlife seemed to bypass the valley entirely. Assuming it was poachers setting up illegal tree stands or perhaps teenagers from the border town pulling a prank, I grabbed my heavy winter gear, strapped my tactical flashlight to my vest, and unholstered my standard-issue sidearm. I told myself it was routine. But as I stepped out of the cabin and heard the cabin door click shut behind me, an inexplicable knot formed in the pit of my stomach. By the time I reached the perimeter of Sector 7, night had completely fallen. The canopy of black spruce was so thick it swallowed the moonlight, leaving the forest in a state of absolute, ink-like darkness. The only sound in the entire universe was the rhythmic, metallic crunch of my boots on the frozen mud. And then, about 2 miles into the hike, the woods went completely dead. Anyone who spends time in the deep wilderness understands the natural nighttime ambience, the rustle of dry leaves, the distant hoot of a great horned owl, the scurry of small rodents in the underbrush. But this was different. The wind died instantly, as if a massive hand had suffocated the air. The temperature dropped so fast I could feel the cold biting through my insulated layers. The silence felt heavy, pressurized, and synthetic, like the air inside a sealed vacuum chamber. My instincts, honed by over a decade of survival, were screaming at me to turn around and walk back to the truck. Every nerve in my body was on fire. But duty, and a stubborn sense of rationality, pushed me forward. I began to climb the steep, rocky ridge that overlooked the basin of the dead zone. As I neared the crest, I turned off my tactical flashlight, allowing my eyes to adjust to the darkness so I wouldn't give away my position to potential poachers. I scrambled up the final embankment, parted the freezing pine needles of a low-hanging branch, and looked down into the valley. My breath caught in my throat. Deep in the basin, about half a mile away, a dull, crimson glow was bleeding through the dense grid of tree trunks. It wasn't the flickering, organic orange of a campfire. It wasn't the harsh, focused white beam of a high-powered hunting torch. It was a pure, solid, monochromatic blood-red light. It didn't cast shadows the way normal light does. It seemed to coat the forest floor in a thick, unnatural luminescence. I unclipped my binoculars from my vest, adjusting the focus dial to pierce through the thick brush. What I saw defied any logical explanation. There wasn't just one source of light. There were dozens of them. They were perfectly spherical orbs, roughly the size of basketballs, hovering exactly 6 feet off the frozen ground. They didn't bob up and down like lanterns, nor did they drift with the freezing wind that had suddenly begun to howl over the ridge. They were completely, terrifyingly motionless. More disturbing than the orbs themselves was their arrangement. They were spaced precisely 12 feet apart, forming a massive, mathematically perfect geometric circle in the middle of the dense forest. Trees grew inside the circle, but the orbs hovered around them, as if they had bypassed the physical matter of the environment to maintain their perfect formation. I felt a sudden, icy drop in my chest. I pulled out my thermal imaging camera, a top-of-the-line FLIR unit used for search and rescue operations. I needed to see if there were human signatures down there. I raised the viewfinder to my eye. The screen didn't show the warm yellows and reds of human bodies or campfire heat. Instead, the entire area inside the circle of crimson spheres registered as a stark, void-like blue. It was a temperature so low it shouldn't have been possible on Earth, absolute zero. As I watched through the thermal lens, the battery indicator on the device, which had been fully charged when I left the station, began to rapidly tick downward. Asterisk 90%. 60%. 30%. Dead, asterisk. The screen went black. Simultaneously, the heavy tactical radio strapped to my shoulder emitted a low, rhythmic pulse of static. It wasn't the chaotic hiss of a lost signal. It was steady. Rhythmic. Asterisk thump. Thump. Thump, asterisk. It sounded exactly like a human heartbeat, echoing out into the freezing night air. Driven by a mixture of terror and an intense, almost hypnotic curiosity, I began to crawl down the slope of the ridge, moving closer to the perimeter of the red lights. The closer I got, the more the air smelled of copper and ozone, the sharp, metallic scent you smell right before a massive lightning strike. I stopped behind the trunk of an ancient, lightning-scarred oak tree, barely 30 yards from the outermost red sphere. Up close, the lights didn't hiss or hum. They were silent. But the air around them was vibrating so intensely that the fillings in my teeth began to ache with a dull, throbbing pain. Suddenly, the geometric circle began to alter. The red spheres didn't glide through the air. They moved with an impossible, jerky precision, snapping from one position to the next in fractions of a second, like a stop-motion film playing at the wrong speed. The outer circle began to contract, closing in toward a single, darkened point in the absolute center of the clearing. As the crimson light intensified, concentrating into the center, I saw what they were gathering around. In the middle of the clearing stood a figure. It was incredibly tall, easily 8 or 9 feet, and painfully, unnaturally thin. Its limbs were elongated, the elbows and knees bending at angles that looked biologically impossible. It wore no clothes, but its skin wasn't flesh, it was a matte, charcoal black substance that seemed to absorb the red light rather than reflect it. It stood perfectly still, its long, needle-like fingers hanging down past its knees. I raised my binoculars with trembling hands, aiming at the creature's head. It had no face. There was no nose, no mouth, no jawline. There were only two hollow, deeply sunken sockets where I should have been. And inside those sockets, there was nothing but the same, infinite, blood-red glow. One by one, the hovering spheres began to merge directly into the creature's chest. With every orbit absorbed, the creature's body began. Then, in a single millisecond, the sound stopped. The vibration ceased. The red spheres vanished completely. The forest was plunged back into a suffocating, absolute pitch blackness. I froze against the oak tree, holding my breath, my heart hammering against my ribs so hard I was certain it would give away my position. I couldn't see my own hand in front of my face. A split second later, a freezing, violent gust of wind slammed into the valley, carrying that horrific smell of copper and decaying copper. My instinct took over. I reached down, grabbed my heavy tactical flashlight, and clicked the switch. The bright white beam cut through the dark. The creature was standing directly in front of me. It wasn't 30 yards away anymore. It was less than 3 feet from my face. Its charcoal skin was glistening with a strange, oily residue. It leaned down, its empty, red-eyed face inches from my own. I couldn't move. My muscles were entirely paralyzed, locked in place by a primal terror I didn't know the human body could experience. It didn't attack me. It didn't claw at my throat. Instead, it opened a jagged, seamless slit across the bottom of its featureless face, a mouth that hadn't been there a second before. Inside my head, not through my ears, but directly inside the gray matter of my brain, a voice spoke. It wasn't a human voice. It was a chaotic, overlapping jumble of radio frequencies, emergency broadcast tones, and the sound of tearing flesh, synthesized into a single sentence. Asterisk, we are shifting the line. Asterisk. I don't remember running. I don't remember climbing back up the ridge, or navigating the miles of dark, frozen forest back to the perimeter. The next thing I knew, I gasped for air, slamming forward against the steering wheel of my Ranger truck. The engine was idling, the heater blasting hot air into the cabin. Dawn was breaking over the horizon, painting the sky in pale shades of gray and orange. My hands were gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles were white, and the skin across my palms had split open and bled onto the leather. I looked at the digital clock on the dashboard. It was 7:14 a.m. I had gone into the woods at 4:30 p.m. the previous afternoon. More than 14 hours had passed, but to my brain, it had felt like 20 minutes. I had lost over half a day of my life inside that basin. When I looked in the rearview mirror, my nose was caked in dried blood, and the irises of my eyes were bloodshot, surrounded by broken capillaries. I didn't bother packing up my station. I drove straight to the regional headquarters, dropped my badge, my sidearm, and my keys onto the superintendent's desk, and walked out without saying a single word. The official report, which I received a copy of weeks later via mail, filed the entire incident as a severe case of hypothermia-induced visual and auditory hallucinations brought on by extreme exposure. They claimed the timber loggers had simply seen a weather balloon or a satellite re-entry. But I know what I saw. I know the difference between a freezing mind and a shifting reality. I moved 3 states away, into the heart of a crowded, noisy concrete city. I chose an apartment on the 14th floor, surrounded by streetlights, neon signs, and the constant hum of traffic. I chose a place where the lights never turn off, because I can no longer tolerate the dark. But sometimes, during the dead hours of the night, when a heavy fog rolls off the coast and muffles the sound of the city traffic, I look.
Horrorbox FM with fear.